Well, pensioners are having their homes taken off them. Young people are being plunged into massive debt if they want an education. Disabled and the elderly are having their daycare centres closed. Around a quarter of families are lacking a decent state of living, we hear this week. And thousands of those are having to turn to food banks now to feed their children. It's not as if the money's not there. It's in the hands of the 1%, many who pay no tax at all. In a scandal that's only now unfolding, many BBC government employees are paid as a company as well. Where that company is based is in a tax haven. They pay no income tax. On BBC Question Time recently, the Lord Chancellor and Bilderberger, Kenneth Clarke, blushed red as he explained tax havens must be closed. So did he really mean it? Well, it's an old story, but brought into sharp focus when the rest of us, even those with a job, can't make ends meet. John Christensen directs the International Secretariat of the Tax Justice Network, a research-led global coalition of experts and activists. He trained as an auditor and an economist and has worked in many countries around the world, including in secrecy jurisdictions, which I'm sure he'll tell us about, where he worked in offshore financial services with Touche Ross & Co. For 11 years, he was economic advisor to the government of the British Channel Island of Jersey. In the past 10 years, he's become what The Guardian has described as the unlikely figurehead of a worldwide campaign against tax avoidance. Well, hi, John, and welcome to Drive Time.
Well, hello, Tony.
First of all, can you just tell us whereabouts are the biggest tax havens?
Well, you know, many people think the tax havens are sitting in the Caribbean or little islands in the Channel or Gibraltar, places like this. You know, the really big tax havens are countries like United States, Switzerland, Luxembourg, Netherlands, and would you believe United Kingdom. These are the really big players in this game. Most of them are powerful countries who have political connections. In the case of the United Kingdom, for example, we're closely connected to the Channel Islands, to the Cayman Islands, to Bermuda. And all of these tiny little islands, which people think of when they think of tax havens, are part of the British spiderweb, as we call it, of tax havens that feed money into the City of London. So we're talking about very big and very powerful countries, which for many years, for decades in fact, have been protecting tax havens, supporting them, blocking global attempts to clamp down on them. And when we hear senior politicians talk in London about wanting to close down, I think we should take it with a very, very big pinch of salt, because they have no intention of doing anything about these places.
So you're saying that Kenneth Clarke didn't really mean what he said then, when he says, oh, we really must do something about this, on Question Time the other week?
Well, I heard people talking in the 1970s about we must do something about tax havens. I heard the same in the 1980s, the 1990s. 3 years ago, the Prime Minister talked to the G20, and in the Senate in Washington, he stood up and said the time has come to close down the tax havens. And do you know what? Time and time again, Britain takes the lead in blocking attempts to close down tax havens. So, no, I'm afraid I don't believe politicians when they say this.
Now, once upon a time, you weren't actually able to just ship vast amounts of money abroad. When did that all change? Is there any point that you can say, well, it was the whole sort of tax haven boom started at a certain time, in the 70s or something?
Well, that's right. You know, back in from the 1940s onwards, after the war, a new settlement was put into place. It was called the Bretton Woods Settlement, with the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund there. And what they did was they made it very hard indeed for people to export capital from one country to another, because they recognized quite rightly that capital moving around from one place to another can be very destabilizing and encourages tax evasion. So they put into place a whole apparatus around the world, but it didn't stop people, but it certainly brought the tax evasion down to a very low level. It all started going wrong, I think, in the early 1970s when President Nixon, under huge pressure because of the Vietnam War, he was under pressure to protect the dollar, and he started to allow American banks and others to shift and start operating in London in a pretty unregulated market called the Eurobond market. And at that stage, the whole tax haven thing began to really pick up big time from the 1970s onwards. And it was a key part of Mrs Thatcher's development strategy for this country to deregulate London in order to attract these huge illicit financial flows from other countries.
But that's one thing to say, you want to attract money in, but, surely that's not the same thing as saying, well, people should be able to ship all their money out of the country.
Well, the trouble is we've never been too fussy. We're not too fussy about what money comes in, and we're not particularly fussy about how our own elites shift their affairs offshore into Luxembourg and Switzerland and so on. And if you want evidence for, the way in which the British government talks the talk of tackling tax evasion but doesn't actually walk it, the truth of the matter is this year they've negotiated a new deal with Switzerland to protect British tax evaders using Switzerland. And we know the scale of money involved runs to many billions of pounds, but the British government isn't prepared to take active steps to close it all down, mainly because the people who use offshore accounts in Switzerland are engaged in tax evading in Switzerland and places like Jersey are, let's be honest, very closely connected to the political elites and the business elites that shaped policy in London.
Now, I can remember a couple of years ago, a plucky banker, at least he was working in a bank, Rudolf Elmer, he actually got a whole bunch of tax evaders on a on a CD drive and copied it, and he took it to WikiLeaks. And if I remember rightly, he was actually arrested for his trouble. Now, the idea here was he was trying to expose the names of people and also the amounts that were being kept secretly in these Swiss bank accounts. So what do you know about his case?
Well, that's right. I was, in fact, with Rudy when he handed the CDs across to Julian Assange from WikiLeaks. Rudy is, in many respects, he's a really heroic guy. He's just an ordinary bank manager. He was working for a Swiss bank, and he was sent to work in the Cayman Islands, which is a British tax haven in the Caribbean. And what he discovered when he turned up at that branch was hair-raising. He discovered that there were very weak compliance. Most of the clients involved in this Cayman Island branch were involved in tax evasion. So he started saying to his board back in Switzerland, look, we've got a lot of problems here. We've got to sort this out. And instead of saying, we'll support you, the bank said, we don't want to know about this. It's not your job to sort it out. You just do your job and carry on. And he persisted, and they refused to take action. And eventually he said, enough's enough. I'm walking out on this one. If you aren't prepared to take action, we're sitting here on a lot of criminal accounts and criminal clients. I'm going to go public, which is what he did. And what happened next is really ugly, because not only did the bank start to attack him and his family, but he found that the Swiss government didn't support him. In fact, they started to harass him, and eventually they arrested him and put him into jail. And it was only because we started to kick up a fuss in the international press and embarrass the Swiss government that they backed down a bit. But he still hasn't got a job, and he's still being harassed. So it's a very ugly situation.
Yes, it's pretty awful when there's no protection for whistleblowers. But ultimately, how big is this whole tax haven economy? Have you any idea?
Well, look, first of all, the tax haven economy is on a massive scale. It's so big that I would say now we've got to think about it as being a huge part of the global economy. Here's some estimates. There are no official statistics, and I would say one of the strangest things about the whole tax haven economy is that there are no official statistics. But here are some reasonably good figures. We know that at least half of world trade is passed on paper through tax havens in order for big companies to evade and avoid tax. Half of world trade goes on paper. We know that almost all cross-border investment goes through tax havens, again, in order to evade and avoid tax. The amount of private wealth held offshore in tax havens. Now take a deep breath, because first of all you have to understand what a trillion is here. A trillion is 1 million million, or 100 billion. So the sums we're talking about here are massive. The amount of wealth held offshore in tax havens evading tax is well over 20 trillion US dollars. Well, that's a global figure. We're talking massive sums. In terms of the United Kingdom, we think that the best estimate I've seen suggests that the United Kingdom loses at least £18 billion every year from tax evasion through tax havens. So
well, I suppose
this affects us all because it means that our schools are being cut back, our education services are being cut back, our health services are being cut back, because the government won't tackle this issue.
Well, I suppose the obvious question is exactly that. Why? I mean, it seems to make sense to say, no, you can't do this anymore. Why don't the government say, no, you can't, and then they can collect all of that wealth and skim it off in taxation?
Okay, this is a really huge question. And look, I've been studying this for 35 years, and as you said earlier on, I actually went offshore to work in the tax havens to find out how they operate. And ended up being economic advisor to the government of Jersey for 11 years. And what I discovered there was, the reason why the UK government and other governments won't take action is because our elites use tax havens so extensively. The rich people in Britain, the powerful companies that use Britain, use tax havens right the way across the board. And of course, they're not going to vote like turkeys. They're not going to vote for Christmas. They will not take action against tax havens. In fact, I've been an observer to the United Nations committee that's trying to tackle this for over a decade now, and I've watched how British government officials block attempts to tackle tax havens. I've seen exactly the same happening within the European Union. It is typically Britain, working with places like Luxembourg and Austria, that lead attempts to block progress to tackle tax havens. So we, the British public, are victims of the tax haven culture. Our rich elites and our powerful elites protect that very culture for their own reasons.
But how does this actually affect the rest of us? How does it affect ordinary people here in Britain?
Well, it affects us not only because we're losing a great deal of tax revenue, which means that our public services are being cut.
Have you any idea? Have you any idea, John? Can you put a rough ballpark figure on, how much we are losing?
Well, as I said earlier, the best estimate I've seen, and this comes from a company that specialises in this kind of research, is that we lose $18 billion a year to tax avoidance, tax evasion through tax havens. That's only part of the equation, because tax avoidance and tax evasion also happens here domestically in Britain. So the overall tax losses from tax evasion amount to $70 billion a year. And tax avoidance costs us about $25 billion a year. So the sums involved are absolutely massive. And the trouble is that the government really isn't serious about wanting to tackle this, because if it was serious, it would recruit more people into revenue and customs to start clamping down on this.
In fact, it's doing the opposite, isn't it? It's
done exactly the opposite, and that's the issue. And they say, well, we're adding staff. They're not adding staff. They are, in fact, cutting staff from revenue and customs. So the situation is likely to deteriorate. What does it mean for ordinary people? It means that ordinary people in Britain actually end up paying more tax because, whilst rich people are avoiding and evading taxes on a massive scale, the government responds to that by increasing VAT and increasing other types of taxes and cutting our tax allowances because they're not prepared to tackle the tax evasion and tax avoidance. That means that all of us end up suffering in two ways. We end up paying more tax, but we also lose the public services. So it's really having a dramatic effect upon all of us individually.
Now, you seem to be almost implying that these tax havens have had quite a major role to play in the financial crisis.
Yeah, yes, they have played an extraordinary part in the financial crisis, and they continue to play